My next guest was like most Americans, growing up an obese kid who didn't give much thought to his diet until age 16 when he spent 3 days in the ICU with blood sugar levels at nearly 600. He was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. That meant without a working pancreas, he was required to inject insulin anytime he ate carbohydrates or risk permanent bodily damage or death. This diagnosis led him to be so obsessed with how the body works, he grew up to be a diabetes researcher. Since then, he's led 2 NASA investigations, a project for the United States Special Ops Command, and assisted on projects for Department of Defense, DARPA, and the Office of Naval Research. He's currently a research scientist at Sansum Diabetes Research Institute and actively investigating the role of lifestyle interventions and carbohydrate restriction in both diabetes management and prevention, including experimenting on himself. Today, he's going to share his personal experience and research findings as we explore the question, does diet matter if you have to take insulin anyway? Pensacola to Santa Barbara, outcome optimizer, diabetic diabetes researcher, Dr. Andrew Koutnik. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for doing this.
This is great. That was probably the coolest introduction that's ever been done. So I appreciate that, Meredith. People don't believe everything she just said, but no, this is an honor. This is wonderful. It is really cool to be here.
I'm so glad that we're doing this. I think some people might feel like type 1 diabetes is a little specific for a whole podcast episode, but I have 2 cousins on different sides of the family who have type 1 diabetes, and I keep running into people in Pensacola who have it, which kind of is making me question things. Is type 1 diabetes on the rise?
It is absolutely on the rise. It's expected to double within the next couple of decades. And the numbers historically were estimated a bit lower than recent estimations worldwide actually put it at. I think we're a little over 8 million people worldwide. It's also important to acknowledge that a conversation around type 1 diabetes has a lot of relevance to metabolic health in the general population and quite a lot of relevance to those who are on their path or do have type 2 diabetes as well.
So anything that we talk about for people with type 1 diabetes could be relevant or important for people who are either borderline or already type 2, is what you're saying?
Yeah, there's a lot of overlaps. So with someone with type 1 diabetes, there's quite a bit you can learn from the pathology or what happens in someone with diabetes, which we can dive into if you're interested, that teaches you about metabolic health that applies to everyone, frankly.
So when we think about the lifestyle intervention part of it, we do tend to think of like type 2 diabetes because the goal there is to reverse the diagnosis, obviously. But if you can't reverse type 1 diabetes, why bother with a special diet?
So that's a great question. A lot of people have largely focused on the idea that this is not a choice disease. In the context of type 1 diabetes, just like in type 2 diabetes, what you do in your lifestyle, particularly nutrition, has tremendous impact on your overall health. In the context of type 1 diabetes, most patients have double the normal blood glucose levels. So normal glucose levels in the blood are 70 to 120 milligrams per deciliter. And average levels of glucose over a 2 to 3 month period of time are measured by these blood measurements called HbA1c. So it's the amount of glucose that sticks to something called a hemoglobin or red blood cell. And we measure that, and it tells us an average of how high or low our blood glucose has been over 2 to 3 months. Well, in people with type 1 diabetes, the average HbA1c, at least in the most recent reports, is at around 8% to 8.5%. That indicates that the average person with type 1 diabetes is living at double the normal glucose levels. That has tremendous impacts on acute and chronic complications for the disease and ultimately leads to a very shortened life expectancy. Diet has a tremendous impact on regulating glucose. And if glucose is the number one risk factor for some of the major causes and complications related to the disease, then it's paramount to consider how we regulate diet and make a dietary choice in order to improve these outcomes to ultimately improve long-term complications.
So when you said HbA1c A1C. Is that the same as A1C? Because I was thinking A1C was measured with a number, not a percentage. And so I want to be sure if listeners are like me and they're trying to keep track of the ABC 1, 2, 3, type 1, type 2,
Absolutely.
that we're all on the same page.
Yeah. So when most people think of A1C, they're usually almost always referring to hemoglobin A1C. And you get a quote A1C check. What you're referring to is this molecule that's your red blood cell that when you have glucose in the body, some of that glucose sticks to tissues in the body. Well, one of which it sticks to is hemoglobin. So the fancy way of saying it is HbA1c. It's the A1C subunit of the hemoglobin that glucose binds to. But most people just call it A1C.
Okay. And so that is when you say, like, people say, oh, my A1C is 7 or 7.5, then that's different than the percentage number.
So it's the same. So there's two ways of
Oh,
looking
it's
at
the same.
Yep,
Okay.
it's the same. So when you think of a HbA1c number, they usually look at a percentage or millimoles, millimoles per mole. Usually the percentages is used more commonly in the United States, and then millimoles is more common in European countries or other countries around the world. So those are the two different ways HbA1c is observed or looked at. And then there's also these estimated mean glucose values that come from these HbA1c percentages. So like an 8% HbA1c, and most people don't even know this is a percentage, by the way.
Yeah, I had no idea.
So it's like what percentage of the hemoglobin A1C unit is saturated with glucose? But yes, it is a percentage unit. Whether it doesn't really matter though, because the number itself is what defines the average glucose levels.
Right. Yeah. I've heard diabetics describe it as kind of the report card of when they go to the doctor. like 7 is not great, 6 is better, kind of a thing. So you said the reason that diet matters with type 1 diabetes basically is that it has an impact on your health, which I find interesting because the cousins and the friends that I have who are type 1 diabetic, they basically give me the impression that their doctors and their diabetic educators are like, hey, as long as you get the math right, you're good to go. And you are dealt an unlucky hand, but enjoy life and just make sure you take your insulin, finger guns.
Yeah,
Take care.
that's unfortunately not at all how it works, although that is the common message. So when you get diagnosed with disease, it's not your fault. And you go in, you find out for the rest of your life, you're going to have to now check your blood glucose levels and manually take insulin, the most powerful hormone in the entire body, which could be fatal if you overdose it for the rest of your life. The last thing you want to tell someone is that you now have to regulate everything in your lifestyle to manage it. But the truth is, doesn't really matter. Life isn't entirely fair. In the context of this disease, what you do every single day in your lifestyle has a huge impact on your glucose control. So yes, you do have to care about these things. If you don't, you'll be reminded pretty quickly that the choices you are making may not be the best ones for your health. And in the context of type 1 diabetes, nutrition has the most potent impact on glucose control over every other variable in lifestyle in the context of type 1 diabetes. In fact, the same is the case in for other people. They just don't know it as much because in type 1, you have continuous glucose monitors or blood meters that you're given to manage your disease. So you're constantly aware of it. And you're also administering insulin, so you know how much insulin you're giving all the time. So in the context of type 1 diabetes, you're given 24/7 resolution on glucose, 24/7 resolution on insulin, and you get to understand all the factors in your lifestyle that ultimately increase or decrease insulin sensitivity or ultimately increase or decrease glucose values in the blood. And a lot of people outside of type 1 diabetes are trying to learn from this disease on how to actually improve their metabolic health through better glycemic control and lower insulin load by understanding what has happened in type 1.
Which is why you see so many people going around with those like Libre blood glucose sensors on their arm and stuff, and they aren't type 1 diabetic. So it makes sense. I want to talk about your personal experience with lifestyle stuff and the research around diet and exercise and vitality for people with type 1 diabetes. But I want to have a disclaimer first that you and I are discussing research today and your personal outcomes as well, and that this is not medical advice. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, that was our disclaimer. So tell me about your personal experience with playing around with diet and your blood glucose levels? What have you found that is working? What's not worked?
And I guess the best way to introduce this is right from the introduction, right when you get diagnosed. If anyone knows anyone who has been diagnosed, you're pretty quickly told that carbohydrates are king. Okay, that you eat carbohydrates is going to rapidly elevate your blood glucose levels, and you need to take insulin. They call it carbohydrate counting. It's taught to almost everyone with type 1 diabetes. Usually, upon hospitalization, you find out you have type 1 diabetes. You're said, okay, for every 10 to 20 grams of carbohydrates, you need 1 unit of insulin, and that's your insulin carbohydrate ratio. And so everything's focused around carbohydrates because it's the most potent factor in what regulates glucose levels in food. And that's no surprise to anyone. Carbohydrates break down into glucose and rapidly elevate glucose in the blood. But what you also find is that when you try to manage type 1 diabetes on a traditional diet, not only is it my personal experience, but so is it, the literature clearly illustrates this, that the average outcomes for most patients just eating a standard diet, and most patients with type 1 diabetes are eating around 45% of their diet by calories and carbohydrates, that the average HbA1c is resulting in about double normal glucose values. And then you have to ask the question, why? Why is that? Why is, if I'm following all these traditional approaches that I'm being recommended and doing the carbohydrate counting strategy and these other modalities to ultimately improve my outcomes, why are most patients living at double normal glucose? And that may have a lot to do with food. And my personal journey with this is that I actually, now going almost over a decade now, I was playing around with different dietary strategies. I used to be an obese kid, as you mentioned in the introduction. And so, I was fascinated about nutrition and exercise. I wanted to do everything I could do to improve being bigger, stronger, faster, looking better. And then when I got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, it was a whole different level of trying to regulate food and exercise, not just for how I looked or how I performed, but it affected directly how I felt, my overall health at every meal of every single day. And there was a time way back where I was heard of this low carbohydrate diet, right? Because I was doing all the healthy food. I was eating whole foods. I was eating everything that would be recommended, let's say, by the American Diabetes Association or another governing body that says eat whole foods at this many, at least 130 grams of carbohydrates per day. If you look at USDA guidelines or any of these other major food organizations, they always recommend around 50% of your calories coming from carbohydrates in your diet. And, when I had done that and I had followed that recommendation to the gram, I used to count every gram of every piece of food I ate because I was so fascinated about the journey to improve overall health and wellness that naturally I was fascinated to track all of this. Well, one day I had heard that, there's this ketogenic diet. You can eat less carbohydrates in it. You can lose weight, maintain muscle, and lose fat predominantly. I'm like, oh, this is the greatest thing on earth. This sounds amazing. And so I was like, let me try this. And I had actually met a professional athlete with type 1 diabetes about 2 years after I was diagnosed. And I had reached out to them like, hey, what do you think of this approach?
Wait, so you were a teenager when you were reaching out to people and trying to figure this out? You were only 18?
Yes. But what you'll find for anyone who's listening here is that a lot of these people, if you can get their contact information, were just like you and they want to help you too. And so, they actually got on the phone with me and started talking to me about this and actually said, interesting, you're asking about this diet. I'm doing it. This is, how I go about doing it. This is the insulin I take. This is why I take it this way. And I was like, okay. And they're like, yeah, it could really help with your journey. Give it a shot, and I was like, okay. So I did exactly what they said. I lowered my carbohydrates, increased my fat, kept my protein the exact same, switched my insulins around to match the food that I was eating. I lowered the amount of insulin I was taking almost 50%. And I walked into my doctor's office 3 months later. And my doctor at the time, unbeknownst to me, I had no idea, was the American Diabetes Association president. And
oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so he was world famous, amazing guy. I had never known this. And still one of the best doctors I've ever had in my entire life to date. And I walked in his office and, I had my blood work, all this stuff. And he goes, what are you doing? And I'm like, what do you mean? And he goes, well, this is the lowest HbA1c I've ever seen in my office. this is not a HbA1c that reflects someone with diabetes. And I was like, oh, like I'm a kid. So I'm thinking, oh man, I'm doing something special here. And so I started telling him all about the diet and the insulin I was taking. He had invited me to the College of Medicine in the town I grew up in to go speak to them. It was really cool. And this was a nutrition change. I didn't change anything about my exercise habits. I was exercising regularly. I didn't change anything else about my lifestyle. I simply changed my food and had the change in insulin to match it. And I went from an HbA1c of around 7, and I brought it all the way down to 5.6. And I had maintained that diet ever since for the last decade. So yeah, it's been a long journey, but that's actually what opened the door to me realizing just how powerful something as simple as nutrition can be in controlling and regulating health.
That's so incredible. I think that's so cool that your doctor was excited for you. That's always encouraging to hear. We always hear bad, especially diabetes doctor stories. And so it's nice to hear that he was like high-fiving you.
Yep.
So on the research side, what is out there? Is there any research studying low carb or keto diets with people with type 1 diabetes?
Thousands of studies, and ultimately looked at all the studies ever conducted that had a carbohydrate content reported, a patient confirmed to have type 1 diabetes, and an important health outcome related to type 1 diabetes. And there have been 17 reports on very low carbohydrate, or what someone would call a ketogenic diet. There's also things called low carbohydrate diets, which is slightly more carbohydrates, around 51 to 130 grams of carbohydrates per day.
Isn't 130 though what the standard American diet is? So that wouldn't be low carb then, right? It would be less than that.
So the standard American diet, well, I guess let's unpack that too. So when someone says they're
Yeah.
eating a standard American diet,
Which no one says, by the way. No one is admitting, oh, I eat the sad diet. Like, said no one ever.
the sad American diet, yeah.
Yeah, everyone would just say like, oh, I eat whatever. They're not going to be like, yep, I'm really hair flip, loving the sad diet. It's really doing a lot of great things for me.
That's
No,
hilarious.
it's not happening.
No, yeah, because unfortunately the sad diet is also what you call the Western diet. And that's that
Yeah.
nothing but notoriety is ascribed to that diet because they're typically called obesogenic diets because they cause people to typically overeat. They're low on nutritional value. There's a lot of reasons why people don't want to be on those diets. But to your question about the amount of carbohydrates in the diet, actually the average American is eating between 45 and 50% of their calories from carbohydrates per day. And if you were to assume a 2,000 calorie diet, you're looking at a little over about 225 grams or more per day.
Holy shit.
Yeah, so a lot.
That is
Yeah.
so many carbs. Oh my God.
Yes. And for a lot of people, that's nothing, right? Like if you're talking,
Well,
yeah.
like I think most people don't even grasp. Most people don't carb count, so it's okay. But like one hamburger bun, I think is like 28 grams. So just to kind of give people context of like the carb situation. So what positive results are type 1 diabetics getting from adapting a low carb lifestyle?
I can speak on at least the preliminary analysis that we've done so far. It is abundantly clear that the amount of carbohydrates you consume in the diet has a direct impact on key metrics of health outcomes in type 1 diabetes, like HbA1c and insulin levels. What we have observed is that when you look at all the studies from, let's say, a very low carbohydrate diet compared to a low carbohydrate diet compared to moderate or high carbohydrate diets, it is very, very clear that you get much better glycemic control based on the evidence, the weight of the evidence, by going lower carbohydrate. The lower you go, it appears the better the results. In fact, over 3/4 of all studies ever published on low carb, which is just 10 to 25% of total calories from carbohydrates, not even very low, a large portion of them, about 3/4, achieve the ADA guidelines of less than 7% HbA1c. There is no therapy currently available to patients that achieves that reliable results of hitting the ADA targets of less than 7%. No pharmaceutical intervention, no technology that does that right now.
I think that's pretty striking that no pharmaceutical intervention is able to achieve what a diet lifestyle intervention has been able to achieve so far. But I still think there's people out there that might just not really care that their blood work looks better when they go to their doctor's appointment. I think they might be interested in other outcomes. Like, I don't know if you have access to that or if you've read anything, but has there been any anecdotes about their energy levels or their eyesight, or, diabetics worry about neuropathy,
Yep.
not having a feeling in their fingers or toes, sexual function and dysfunction, going into when you have really low blood sugar and you might get dizzy, stuff like that. Have you read any research about impacts that the low carb diet has on those symptoms, if you will?
Yes, and that actually circles all back to the key metrics we looked at. So we pulled every major biomarker from those. And actually, everything you're talking about, when you're talking about your eyes, your nerves, your kidneys, these are microvascular tissues that have microvasculatures that are highly prone to glucose values. And so when you think about, hey, how is my vision, or how are my nerves, how is my kidney function, that's a function that is directly impacted by glucose levels more than anything else. So when we talk about, hey, I shrug at my blood work, shouldn't be shrugging at the blood work, because the blood work is what is telling you your risk for these complications related to your eyes, related to your nerves, related to your kidneys. But your glucose values are also the number one predictor of the primary cause of death of people with type 1 diabetes, or frankly, all forms of diabetes, which is cardiovascular disease. Patients with type 1 diabetes are at 10 times the risk for cardiovascular disease over their lifetime. And that has to do with the primary risk factor for cardiovascular disease and primary risk factor for every microvascular complication, HbA1c, which is a measure of your chronic glucose control. So when people look at, their blood work and say, oh, no big deal, it might not be a big deal today, but 10, 20, 30 years from now, it will be a big deal. There's plenty of evidence that says that within the first 4 years of diagnosis, even in kids who are diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in adolescents or pediatric patients, within 4 years, there's signs of subclinical arterial damage within 4 years. There's also signs of neuroanatomical changes on MRI in children, and there's also reliably lower IQ in patients with type 1 diabetes, all of which is associated with glycemic control. Okay. Because what's the one thing that changes in a patient with type 1 diabetes? They're typically the same body weight as the general population. They have normal lipids on average. There's not a whole lot of things that are going wrong, except you lose beta cell function and you have dysglycemia, high and variable glucose levels. And that is the number one risk factor for all these issues. And so it is important, but a lot of people may not be able to resonate with something that's going to happen to them, until the end of their life, because they're thinking about right now. Well, I can tell you that
Right.
most patients with type 1 diabetes know exactly how it feels to have high and variable glucose values, because that's what symptoms of hyperglycemia and hypoglycemia are. They're physical and mental health symptoms: fatigue, confusion, irritability, loss of concentration, anxiousness, shakiness. These are physical and mental health symptoms that impact your day in and day out quality of life, and often the people around you. So you cannot get away from the impacts of glucose in type 1 diabetes. And it's not surprising that people outside of type 1 diabetes are growing to appreciate the impacts that glucose has from the learned experience of the more potent and transparent awareness we have in type 1.
That is so fascinating. Okay, and this is so different than what some doctors are communicating to their patients. Or, to be fair, because I always try to be fair, it's at least different than what the patient is interpreting the doctor's information to be. Because here's the message that I'm getting from friends and relatives. Oh yeah, I went to the doctor and, I got a lecture about how I could lose my leg, and I told them I'm using my insulin calculator app and I'm doing everything, but my blood sugars are still playing roller coaster. And the doctor was like, yeah, sometimes diabetes be that way. I'm like, oh, okay. So my point is, this is so potentially much more empowering to a person with type 1 diabetes than, you know what? If you do everything right, still your blood sugar is going to suck. You're still going to lose a limb and you're still going to get diabetic neuropathy and go blind in one eye. Like I think there's this human behavior component to it. And when the doctor is not equipped to share empowering information that includes diet and lifestyle adaptations, then the patient is chucking it in the fuck it bucket because they're like, yeah, I might as well just enjoy life. My doctor says I'm going to die early anyway. And that is so grim and dark, but it is reality. And I do want to talk about the part of this where there's like the disconnect between the research and what the physicians are equipped to tell the patients. Why don't more doctors have knowledge around diet and lifestyle in order to better support their type 1 diabetic patients?
To directly answer your question is because the medical training that allows a physician to be trained on a specific subject is largely focused on interventions that have been studied on phase 3 randomized controlled trials in thousands of patients. And those are usually pharmaceutically funded trials or technology funded trials that allow, you don't have that type of funding for nutrition. You don't have that type of same quality of evidence. And nutrition doesn't mean the evidence isn't there, but the same quality of evidence isn't available because you need funding in the orders of hundreds of millions of dollars to repeat that same type of studies. And so you have to look at the weight of evidence that we do have. And the weight of evidence that we do have clearly illustrates a direct impact on lifestyle. Patients do have a level of agency over their own health. And to think that it doesn't matter is ridiculous. That's completely false. There isn't a lot of nutritional training in medical school, right? It's not on the boards, right? So if you're overwhelmed and oversaturated with everything you're trying to learn, you can't learn everything in medical school that you have to learn. And here's this topic of nutrition, which frankly isn't really even on your boards to begin with. It might be a little component, but not a whole lot. How much time are you going to spend on that when you're trying to survive, through medical school? Probably not a lot. This is not fair to the physician, okay? When something like nutrition comes up as a possible, if not way more potent strategy, and they weren't traditionally trained on it, they're going to look for dietitians or other healthcare providers to be a part of their integrated team to provide that information. But recent analysis has also shown that the vast majority of dietitians don't feel prepared or frankly supported to implement therapeutic carbohydrate restriction. They don't. And this is from Anna Lynn Conklin out of University of British Columbia. And the question I have is, how do we fix it? Because we need to fix this issue of lack of awareness and lack of strategies on how to bridge this gap. Because let's say that this strategy is extremely effective. And I can tell you, I've looked at all the evidence. It's an incredibly powerful therapeutic strategy, one that seems to outcompete with anything else that's out there right now. But to not offer it at all is a problem, right? And to think that patients don't have any control over their health and that food doesn't matter is a problem. It does matter. And there's overwhelming evidence in type 1 and also outside of type 1 diabetes that food and exercise have a huge impact on your overall health, and you cannot be ignored.
I do want to talk about ideas for how people can advocate for themselves in a minute, but I want to first cover the recommendations. The American Diabetes Association, that whole conundrum, they recently tweeted a video telling people with type 1 diabetes to make sure to have carbs at every meal and to cover the carbs with insulin. And so here's my question, especially for you, because you've worked with a lot of like high level government projects and departments. Why would the same government who is telling people who, simplistically speaking, have an intolerance to carbohydrates to go ahead and eat them, but telling or researching at least ketogenic protocols for war fighters to optimize their enhanced cognition? Why is the same government giving two different pieces of advice?
Well, historically speaking, over 100 years ago, very low carbohydrates were standard of care. It was actually a physician named William Sansum, who I actually work at the Sansum Diabetes Research Institute, named after him, the first place to synthesize and administer insulin in the United States. He was one of the main people after discovery of insulin to advocate for higher carbohydrate diets. This was just based on some reports, not randomized controlled trials, just reports, observations that He thought the patients were doing better on a higher carbohydrates approach, and maybe they were at that time. But the first initial guidelines were in the 1960s and 70s, recommending for around 45% of calories by carbohydrates. Not about 10 years later, there was another round of recommendations that advocated for even higher carbohydrate intake. Again, this was in the lack of evidence illustrating that that was superior to lower carbohydrate intake. There had not been any randomized controlled trials to definitively show what percentage of carbohydrates should be recommended. And I can tell you, unfortunately, to today, that also is the case. And so there are randomized controlled trials, but there's an absence of them, particularly on the lowest end for long-term trials, which are what these recommendation bodies are using to make changes in what is previously recommended. So it's still recommended to have at least 130 grams of carbohydrates per day for brain energy needs. We know that you can survive brain energy needs on 0 carbohydrates per day. There's been plenty of evidence. There's evidence that you can fast for days on end and your brain's completely functional and fine. So again, a lot of this is based on precedence of what it was historically recommended, but a lot of what was historically recommended was what was believed to be good, not necessarily evidence-based to be good, and particularly not evidence-based in the context of type 1 diabetes. And that is obviously much more problematic because now we're talking a disease where the impacts of carbohydrates are so clear and potent. I would argue that in the context of type 1 diabetes, carbohydrates have a bigger impact in this disease than almost any other disease does. And so it should, in my opinion, not have the same rules applied to it as those without diabetes. But again, there's precedence. There's a level of evidence that's required that's hard to achieve in nutritional trials to shift these guidelines. And in essence, you need lots of money to do this trials to do this. But that's why we did that systematic analysis to look at everything that had ever been done, to look at what is the overarching trend across every study ever published in carbohydrate content. And the trend is very, very clear that lower carbohydrate diets improve glycemic control across all studies ever done. And that was in a systematic review that pulled over 46,000 patients with type 1 diabetes.
Oh, wow. That was your study that you keep referencing
Yeah.
is 46,000. That's so if I'm hearing you correctly, the reason that we have this recommendation for type 1 diabetics to continue to eat the same amount of carbs as people without diabetes is an institutionalized hypothesis from a long time ago. And second reason, because it's expensive to do nutritional studies, and probably, reason two, subset A, is, no one, like pharmaceutical companies can't make money out of nutritional studies. I'm not sure anybody can. So there's really not a financial incentive to follow that. And then third reason is because the government is perfectly willing to experiment on soldiers. So the soldiers get the keto stuff, and then the rest of us get the standard American diet recommendation.
Well, I could tell you, if you look at all these institutional bodies, there's interest in these other dietary strategies to improve performance in a lot of domains. But the shift away from precedence is often very difficult. It's like the first impression effect. But I will say this. When you look at the progress in type 1 diabetes, there's been tremendous progress in disease management, mostly through technology and some through pharmaceutical. However, right now, as we speak today in 2024, early 2024, the next therapy, the next thing that's on the table that everyone's excited about is next generation hybrid closed loop, aka automatic insulin delivery, aka artificial pancreas. And it's not an artificial pancreas. I think that's a butchered term in the context of these devices, but they're a technology that automatically administer insulin in a response to glucose values. Those technologies do not reliably move HbA1c greater than a single absolute unit percentage. And as most patients are in the 8s, we know that despite a large increase in patient availability and use of hybrid closed loop, continuous glucose monitors, insulin pumps, that HbA1c is, according to the Type 1 Diabetes Exchange or Quality Improvement Collaborative, that just published on a cohort of over 80,000 patients and looked at the really controlled data across patients who they observed over, frankly, close to a decade. Despite this increased incidence of use of all these technologies, HbA1c has gone from 8.5 to 8.4.
Yeah. There's similar outcomes for people with type 2 diabetes who are, understandably looking to be rescued. It's a very human thing to go, help, where's my easy button? Because it's hard to go upstream in a culture where the standard is this diet that literally is called sad. Uh, and I think it creates this extreme of two camps. You've got on the one camp the people that are like, oh my God, I can't wait till the fake pancreas comes out and I can be robotic and cured. And then you have the other group of people that are like, oh my gosh, big pharma is out to get us, that sort of thing, which I want your take. Is it paranoid to think that families with type 1 diabetes can't trust the American Diabetes Association's recommendations to eat carbs at every meal and cover with insulin because insulin manufacturers themselves are funding the ADA? Because the ADA gets over $1 million every single year from major insulin manufacturers. I mean, that sounds like some shady shit.
You bring up a point that has been a problem in many institutions, many large organizations, politics, everything combined. It's hard to say. I'm not a part of the American Diabetes Association. You would hope that an organization that oversees the care of and has one of the largest voices in the context of diabetes, you also have organizations like JDRF, that when the evidence arises that illustrates that there's something very important that could be applied to patients, that they would do so and do so actionably to improve outcomes in patients. It's hard for me to imagine that anyone has ill intent when it comes to that, but maybe by accident, inadvertently, choices are made that may have adverse effects on the population level in patients where a bigger impact could have been made in a positive direction by doing another path. So I can't speak for them and what their choices are, although they post about food, they make recommendations around food. And I also want to give credit to the ADA. They had changed their guidelines recently to allow for an individualized approach, which gave more freedom to healthcare practitioners to actually be able to prescribe diets that may not have fallen in the traditional lane. However, it is worth acknowledging, though, that they still recommend at least 130 grams per day for patients with type 1. If you look at pregnancy guidelines for things like gestational diabetes or patients with type 1 diabetes who are pregnant, it's 175 grams per day. This is all based on the idea that the mother or fetus needs that much carbohydrates to maintain brain health. And the 130 grams is the recommendation is for the same reason. I will say that it's very clear that there needs to be an appreciation for dietary strategies as a very important component to diet and improving overall health. There's no doubt about that. When I ran with the team the systematic analysis, we found that half of the reports in the very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet group, when they reported how they got their recommended advice for what they were eating, over half those reports showed that patients were going and doing this approach rogue. Okay. They were doing it without healthcare support. They also had acknowledged in a number of these reports the disconnect between themselves and the healthcare provider feeling unsupported. This isn't because these people the healthcare practitioners don't want to help patients, but how are healthcare practitioners supposed to help patients if there's no guidelines? If they're supposed to abide by standard of care guidelines that don't actually provide recommendations around very low carbohydrate diets and how to actually effectively manage them around insulin, it's failing the patient and it's failing the healthcare practitioner, period. We also, Meredith, conducted a survey specifically trying to pull out what not the researchers think about diet and type 1 diabetes, but we asked patients and caregivers what they thought about food and their management of type 1 diabetes. Because I think that there's a disconnect sometimes in what the patients actually want to see and what researchers are doing and spending money on to actually assess. And when we asked about food, it was overwhelming that patients felt that food had a big impact on their life. They thought about it quite a lot. It was also interesting that almost 3/4 of all people who responded to the survey, and we had near 1,000 people who actually took the survey, international, most are from the United States and Canada, but we had about 30% were outside of North America. We found that about 70+% had actually done a ketogenic diet, and around the same percentage were still doing one or a low carbohydrate diet.
Wow.
So
That is so interesting.
So there's a large body of, and this could be bias, right? Like maybe the people who took the survey are more apt to do that. Sure, that's all possible. But what it clearly shows is that patients care a lot about food and what they're doing. And there was also in that survey, it was described by patients or the caregiver of patients with type 1 diabetes that they felt when you asked them, are you willing to make a dietary or lifestyle change to improve your outcomes if you knew it could improve your outcomes? 2/3 said yes. And so patients are willing to change. They're willing to do something about it. The vast majority of patients are doing a diet that we don't have guidelines for. And healthcare practitioners have expressed in research and evidence that they don't feel prepared to actually do it. We have problems. And I think it's important we start filling these gaps because it will help patients and it will help the healthcare practitioners who are helping the patients.
Okay, so let's cover self-advocacy, and then I want to talk about some objections or concerns that may come up as people think about this for themselves, knowing that insulin is a major health metric for themselves, even outside of any diabetes. So self-advocacy. So how can a person, if they're listening to this and let's say they have type 1 diabetes, like what's the first good step for them to take? Because obviously, we're talking about a lot of math here. We're talking about their own body's reaction to their own brand of insulin that they're taking. We're talking about counting the carbs that are in the foods that they're eating. If you're eating healthier, you're probably cooking things at home that requires a new level of carb counting. And then, as you mentioned earlier, you kind of switched up your insulin. So there's all kinds of different moving parts to this. So where should someone who's interested in this begin to educate themselves on the next steps to take?
That's a really important question. I think patients need to actually look internally first. There needs to be an awareness for every patient that you are going into that doctor's visit to receive help on your disease. You're getting help. You're not being told what you should or shouldn't do. You are going in to receive advice and guidance and counsel on how to manage your disease. You can hire and fire anyone you want to as the patient. It's a patient centered care. Medicine is about the patient. Okay. And it doesn't mean that healthcare practitioners, we're not like treating them as like nobodies. They're critical components to the medical system and to helping patients receive that care and helping guide patients on that journey. Zero doubt about that. But you are the patient and you're the one who's going to pay for that help. But it's also important to go in and know what type of guidance you want because healthcare practitioners have an unfortunate ask on them. They're asked now more than ever to see more patients than they've ever seen and less time than they've ever had, and do so with a very strict guidelines and also very strict insurance policies about what is and isn't covered. And they're kind of handcuffed. And the patients don't always appreciate that they're going in around precedents of guidelines, insurance, how much time they have to see each patient, and they're just going to give the best advice they can within a short period of time that they're allowed to. And so, as the patient, it's important for you to go in and know what you want out of that appointment. What do you want to see? What medications are you looking to do? And have a plan before you go in so that healthcare practitioner can help you too. If you want to do something that maybe a little untraditional or not within those standard of care approaches, you need to come in prepared to have that conversation and do so in an informed way.
So that's a good approach and good attitude for when they go to their doctor's visit, which, depending on the patient, is every 3 to 6 months. But before that, like if a person with type 1 diabetes wants to just kind of put their toe in the water of what this will make them feel like to see if that makes their blood sugars have more even levels, what's the next good step for them in their home by themselves?
Most patients are going and finding resources on their own. They're looking for books like Diabetes Solutions by Richard Bernstein, who wrote like kind of a how-to guide like 20 years ago on how to do this, which a lot of people have followed and found success. I've actually put out virtually nothing but free resources for patients. If they were to go to my Twitter page and go to the very top, there's something called Linktree. And if you click on that, you can actually go through and find a ton of free resources I've given over the last almost decade on these strategies and other strategies just for information for patients to go to and try to find their own way through this journey. And so that those are some places I would start is, be aware of the books that have been actually evaluated, at least observationally, to be successful. And Diabetes Solutions is one of those. There's others too by Keith Runyon and other authors who live with this disease and tell people how to manage it. There's community groups that help patients on this journey. There's type 1 grit group, which is the one that was actually studied in that analysis, but there's many others. So you have to find the group that is actually doing what you want to do. You have to also make sure that they're actually achieving the results you want to achieve. And if that's what you want to see and that's what you want to be a part of, then you can learn from that group, right? But of course, in a very traditional conservative sense, you want to have the healthcare practitioner on your side. I will also acknowledge the evidence says that patients don't always feel supported on this approach. That's just the evidence. That's what the evidence says right now. And, that's unfortunate, but it's on not just the patient, but the healthcare practitioner. It's not just on the healthcare practitioner, but it's also on the institutions to give guidance on how to do these approaches. Because it wasn't that long ago where I was looking at global public interest in relation to what are the hottest topics in type 1 diabetes using something called Google Trends. I did this last year. And what I found was that, at least as of last year, worldwide over a 5-year period, that the ketogenic diet was the number one rising topic in type 1 diabetes, despite having no guidelines on how to implement it, despite most healthcare practitioners not feeling prepared or supported on how to do this approach, and patients feeling unsupported because the healthcare practitioners don't have the resources on how to do it. They also feel unsupported.
You're right that there is a lot more interest in ketogenic food plans, because when you go to the grocery store, you do start to see these boxes of food that say the word keto on them. I think I even saw some bread that said keto on it. So if you are a person who's trying to manage your blood sugar, maybe one way or the other, type 1, type 2, whatever. I mean, if it says keto, is that keto? Because I feel like they follow different rules. It's like the Atkins rules. Do you remember that from the early 2000s where it was like net carbs, like the fiber subtracted from the carb?
Yeah, I will tell you, you need to look at the label. You need to look at the label and be basically self-educated on what components in that food is actually glycemic or non-glycemic. Like, for example, sweeteners is the easiest thing to look at, but there's actually a list of like 20 to 40 different things that are framed as non-glycemic that actually are glycemic, and you need to be very aware of that. And I would tell you that my experience is that a large quantity of these keto-based foods are not at all keto, like not even close.
Right, because when you look at the back of the box and it says total carbs, let's use tortillas,
Yeah.
for example. It'll still say 23 carbs per tortilla. But then on the front, it says keto, 2 net carbs. And so someone who is trying to watch their blood sugar, are you saying they should pretty much most of the time just go by whatever the carbs are? Like if it says 23 carbs, even though it says keto, just go by that?
No, I'm actually not saying that. Unfortunately, it gets more complicated than that. So, yes, it's not so simple because there's ingredients such as like allulose. Allulose is a non-caloric sweetener. It's known historically to be non-glycemic, non-insulinogenic, just a sweetener replacement. Oh, that's an interesting sweetener all of itself that has unique, potentially very positive metabolic effects in patients with type 1 diabetes. But on a label, they have to label it as having carbs. Even though it's not a carb, it doesn't increase glucose levels, doesn't increase insulin levels. In fact, it actually appears to do the opposite of both those in that particular case. And that's just one example. But I think Diet Doctor actually has a pretty good list, is a one website you can look at where they provide a very long list of things that are to be avoided for patients to look at for things that could or could not have an effect on glycemic control.
Man, the Saturday email for this episode is going to be packed. For anybody new listening to the show on Saturday, I put like, gee, I wish I could have taken notes. It all goes into that email with as many clickable links as the guest mentioned. So it's going to be like very long, but very helpful. And people can obviously connect with you too. Since we're on the topic of sweeteners, in the wellness community, we tend to think of artificial sweeteners as something we generally want to stay away from. They're just a little too spooky. It's like the spooky molecule, except for instead of appearing when you look at it you're like, where did it go? And so we tend to just go, nah, that's probably cancer causing. So we're just going to ignore that. Have you done any research on sweeteners to know which ones are a green light, which ones we should stay away from?
Actually, yes. And we're actually in the process of trying to do more of that, actually, specifically in people with and without diabetes. Let's unpack that. There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
Artificial sweeteners have gotten a very bad rap, some of which is justified, a lot of which is not. And that artificial sweeteners are there to replace calories, still give us sweet flavor. But the question is, is it harmful? Well, I would argue, personally, my opinion is that replacing pure sugar for something that doesn't have any caloric or sugar glycemic effect is a net movement in the right direction, period. Now, if you want to take the next step, there's some artificial sweeteners that have had some suggested data that it might not be for free. Most of that data is in rodents. Okay. So preclinical models haven't actually reached human level data to confirm any positive or negative effect. Most people tend to stay away from the artificial sweeteners and focus on the more novel, actual real sugars. Okay. Real, actual plant derived sweet ingredients. Those are stevia, monk fruit, and allulose, all of which provide a sweet flavor, all of which come from natural plant based components. They're just isolated out in volume and then obviously sold. One thing, let's go through each one of these. For stevia, I've used stevia a lot. It doesn't affect my glucose levels. Stevia seems to be a neutral in this regard. However, for some people, there might be some, whenever you have these sweet flavors and they cause a positive effect in the brain, each person has to kind of go through and consider, is that a net positive for them on their dietary journey? Does it trigger you to be more hungry or not? And there's some emergent evidence I'm familiar with and be able to share more of that when it actually eventually comes out. And actually directly comparing different forms of sweeteners. And I'll just say that I'll leave that for when the time's ready. But for now, it appears that at least stevia is better than this artificial sweeteners and doesn't have a glycemic effect. But be careful about the packaged powdered version of stevia, because what they do is stevia is so sweet that they, in order to make it into a powdered form, they add real sugar to it. Maltodextrin. Yeah. So these packets of Truvia that you see, they're actually a gram of sugar because it's maltodextrin bound to a small portion of stevia. The stevia drives the sweetness, so you don't need much of it, but it's actually basically plastered onto maltodextrin powder to allow it to be in a powdered form. So be careful.
Some bitch.
So be careful about that. But you can get away with that by actually just using the liquid version of stevia. Okay. There's also monk.
Okay.
Yep. So there's monk fruit, which is more of a novel category. There's not been a whole lot on that. And there's this unique sweetener called allulose. It is derived from plants and is actually a real sugar. But what's interesting about allulose is it's actually the same chemical structure as fructose. Everyone knows high fructose corn syrup and all the negative things that come along with that. It's actually a fructose molecule, but it's what they call a C3 epimer. So one of the carbons is flipped. Well, that simple chemical structure change in allulose makes it largely non-digestible. So it's considered a 0-calorie sweetener. Has no negative effect on glucose, negative effect on insulin, but there's all this rodent data that shows that allulose actually potentially, because of its similar structural characteristics as fructose, actually triggers endogenous GLP-1 production, appears to potentially suppress glucagon, and it may be doing this through vagal nerve activation. And there's been a really impressive preclinical study showing this, but there's actually now emergent evidence in humans that have actually shown that if you add allulose to, let's say, other forms of sugar, you can actually blunt the impact of that sugar on glycemic control.
I've read that too. Yeah. I like allulose because I eat low carb. I eat fewer than 50 carbs a day, but I love me some chocolate. And so I'll make brownies with allulose, and I love it because, okay, shit's expensive, first of all. So buyer, just be prepared. But it's 1-to-1. So you don't have to, refigure your measurements for your recipe if you are doing substitutions with a regular brownie recipe. I just used a keto brownie recipe that I found off Pinterest because Pinterest is great, but I like it because it doesn't taste too weird. In coffee, I don't love it. I don't know if it does. It's like great in baked goods, but in coffee, I just don't have sugar in the coffee. But we tried it and it was kind of weird in coffee. But I have read what you said about how it curbs the natural sugar. So I can't wait to hear more about your research on sweeteners. But as we're running out of time, I do want to cover these sort of objections or concerns that some people may have. Certainly people on the internet, when I was preparing for our discussion, there were some interesting things. And something that you said earlier is where we'll start, is there are some counterindications for people who might be considering a ketogenic diet, meaning some people should not do that. Who are those people?
Yeah, so these are kind of staying in the hypothetical world right now, because anyone who has a genetic inability to metabolize fat would have a problem on a ketogenic diet because you're consuming more fat. It's not it is higher in fat, but it's not what you call these high fat diets. It is prescriptively called a ketogenic diet, which is a very specific therapeutic strategy. Some of the things that people typically look at is someone who has, an eating disorder or some type of pre-existing issue revolving food. Those are things where you want to look up front to see, is this a right candidate for this type of nutritional strategy? Or should we maybe be careful about how we approach implementing this strategy? Doesn't mean they're contraindicated. It just means they need to be careful. Contraindications are mostly issues revolving if you can't metabolize things like fat or something along those lines. And those are very, very rare. But when you start talking about some of the concerns around the ketogenic diet, I think that's important to unpack, because those are the most common clinical discussions revolving the ketogenic diet. And I want to say upfront that the vast majority of these, or almost all of these, are frankly in the hypothetical, theorized lane. We don't really have hardcore evidence to directly address or say, yes, this is a problem or it is not a problem, which frankly means there's no evidence. Like, there's no real hardcore evidence for a lot of these things. But we can go through each of those one by one and talk about each one.
Yeah. The one that people have kind of expressed concerns to me or around me is, oh, well, that's, a lot of meat and a lot of fat. For type 1 diabetics, you said earlier, they can be front of the line, if you will, at risk for a cardiac event. And that's something that, my cousins have heard firsthand from their physician, is like, hey, you should probably take a statin, even though, you're 25. So how do you keep your cholesterol low on a mostly animal protein and fat diet?
A very common occurrence that is observed when someone goes on a very low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet is they're lowering carbohydrates, but also increasing fat intake. Sometimes a lot of that fat by default comes from animal-based fats, which is saturated fat. We know saturated fat can increase LDL. Well, there's a lot of evidence that says that LDL elevation is linked to cardiovascular disease. But let's remind everyone about what we talked about earlier, which is the number one risk factor for cardiovascular disease and type 1 diabetes is HbA1c, which is glucose control. The number one risk factor for microvascular, so eye, kidney, nerve diseases, is glycemic control. Actually, if you look at the risk of hierarchy, there's a paper published in 2016 by the DCC and EDIC group. First author was Nathan et al. That actually looked at the cardiovascular risk factors in type 1 diabetes. And they ranked them proportional to what was the most impactful was least impactful, using a very refined statistical model. They actually used multiple models in this analysis. The number one modifiable risk factor, besides diabetes duration and age, was HbA1c, as we talked about. Next one on the list of hierarchy below that, blood pressure. Okay, modifiable. Next thing on that list was triglycerides. And then next is heart rate. You keep going lower and lower and lower. The very bottom one on that list was LDL. And so LDL cholesterol is what is commonly concerned or at a concern from a cardiologist, lipidologist, when you eat animal-based protein and increase saturated fat intake and see LDL rise. Well, the thing to unpack here is that, yes, LDL has been very clearly linked with cardiovascular disease, but the difference on a very low carbohydrate diet in the context of type 1 diabetes is it's not the predominant risk factor of hierarchy. The number one risk factor of hierarchy is glycemic control. So it's the same analogy as, hey, I'm going to worry about the rims on my car, even though my engine's broken. You got to focus on the main, most important variable. Once you address that, go to your next one. Blood pressure. You have that control. Okay, you got the control. Go to the next one. Triglycerides and heart rate. Go to the next one. You go down the list, but you have to do this in the order of what matters most to long-term outcomes. LDL is really far down that list comparable to those other factors. But that's not to say it doesn't matter at all. When you do a diet like this, you have to consider the comprehensive risk factors related to its implication on short and long term outcomes. So, if someone's on this diet and they have remarkable glycemic control, but comparatively on other diet, they had higher glycemic control, well, they're already addressing the number one risk factor. So, it's hard to make a different choice, right? Address the number one risk factor, then that's what you should be doing, in my opinion. Well, once you have that addressed and you address all the other risk factors, should you consider lowering LDL? And I believe the answer to that is probably yes. I mean, if all the weight of the evidence says that higher is potentially leading to increased risk factors, should you care about it? I think the answer to that is probably yes. But there's also a lot of evidence that says when you subdissect out the type of LDL particle from large to small, that the smaller portion of LDL is at much higher risk. And so we know that on very low carbohydrate diets, that the evidence suggests that when people go on these diets, they actually have a disproportionate shift from small dense LDL to high dense LDL. So the risk of the actual LDL itself seems to, in theory, be lower based on the evidence of other randomized controlled trials that looked at risk. But if someone really wants to get an advanced panel and actually look into more depth in this, they can get these advanced lipid panels, NMR analysis of things like small and large dense LDL molecules, ApoB, LP little a. All these things give you a more advanced picture of your cardiovascular risk and health. And it's probably worth doing for a lot of these individuals. But keep in mind, you have to focus on the primary risk factor of cardiovascular disease, and that is glycemic control. Fix that first, worry about the rest later.
And some physicians may be resistant to order these labs for you, but I was listening to somebody else. I'm so excited that you mentioned this because they were talking about how you can ask for an LDL-P, P stands for particle test, as a more sophisticated way to just check out your risk for a cardiovascular event. The last objection that people bring up is this sustainable? Is it actually realistic to live a whole life eating fewer than 50 carbs a day?
Well, one, we know people can do it. It has been done. I've done it for over 10 years and haven't gone off course. But anytime you talk about a medical intervention, most people say you can't maintain compliance because they look at these long-term randomized controlled trials in other diseases, not type 1, like obesity, and show that there's a kind of reduction in compliance long-term with any dietary strategy. The fact that people have difficulty complying with any lifestyle intervention long-term. But again, that applies to a DASH diet, the Mediterranean diet, the Ornish diet. They're all in the same category. This is not unique in this way, but it's up to the person. What does the person want? And if someone wanted to approach the strategy, they see remarkable results and nothing else is really giving them those same results, well, then it is a commitment.
Well, yeah, I mean, you mentioned the mental health piece earlier, and nutritional psychiatry is something that I'm actually kind of interested in, and the impact of our relationship with food from like a, I don't know, behavior standpoint, but also our relationship with food on a chemical level. Like the idea that it's separate is kind of dissolving for me personally, just from things that I'm kind of, learning about on the side. So the idea that someone without any disposition to diabetes could benefit from experimenting with this chemical relationship with food in our bodies and seeing what it does, and through that be empowered by the effect of it. I mean, that's kind of exciting, but I'm pretty nerdy, so I don't know.
There's a lot of evidence, and there's been a huge movement by something called the metabolic mind movement. There's researchers like Ian Campbell. There's a whole foundation around this by the Bazuki family trying to grow evidence and understanding the impact between food and mental health, specifically in psychiatric disorders. And I think it's pretty clear that your overall metabolic health does have an impact on your mental health. And, there's actually a recent pilot trial from Stanford demonstrating that people with psychiatric diagnoses undergoing a ketogenic diet, actually a large portion of them had improvements in their symptoms and beyond. When we talk about type 1 diabetes, nutrition plays a massive disproportionate impact on metabolic health and gives you a real unique insight onto the impact that food has on things like glucose and insulin, more so than any other disease does. You can really look at that disease as an example of what food can do. So it's really important for people to at least try to understand the relationship they have with food and also try to do something to improve whatever way it may be. Maybe it's just making a minor change in their diet, or maybe it's shifting to more whole foods based approaches and removing sugar from their drinks. All these are simple, low-hanging fruits, but ultimately could have profound impacts, multifold larger than the effort they had to put in for their own health.
Yeah, I love that. This has been such a good conversation. Thank you so much for this. And thank you for the research that you're doing. I think you have such a unique and specific vantage point to conduct and communicate this research, being a type 1 diabetic yourself. So if people want to stay in touch with the research that you're doing and the sweetener research and studies that you're bound to do in the future, where's the best place for them to follow you? Is it on social media, or do you have a newsletter?
Yeah, I'm on social media. I stay most active on Twitter. It's AKOUTNIK. So my first initial, last name, A Koutnik. I do try to stay engaged and up to date there. I do have an Instagram, Andrew Koutnik, PhD. And I also, if you ever reach out via email, then I'll do my best to respond in a timely manner, although sometimes the emails get a little crazy. You open your inbox and all of a sudden it's doomsday, so it's a little touch and go when it comes to that. But yes, I stay pretty active.
Awesome. Well, thank you. This was awesome.
Well, I appreciate it, Meredith. Thank you guys for listening.